Hello everyone, welcome to week 2 of ABA 525. You'll notice that no, I still do not have a webcam. I'm just waiting for final approval from the college to get a new computer. Anyhow, I very much enjoyed all the discussions this week on the ABLs are, and the VB map. And I'm trying to get you some resources regarding the VB map that we can look at and discuss. Anyways, this week we're going to start talking about verbal behavior, and specifically today we're going to look at the MAND. Okay, over the course of about 2 or 3 lectures, we're going to identify, describe. You should be able to identify, describe, and give examples of different verbal operands. Identify under what antecedent control each verbal operand occurs. Describe specifically what a MAND is and how it functions. Now, Weatherby and Prezant in 2000 said that 50% of children with autism do not speak, or they have abnormal patterns in language development. For example, having echolalia, which is simply the repeating of statements immediately after they're heard. So if I said, "Hi Charlie," Charlie would say, "Hi Charlie." Or they have this type of non-functional repetition of statements heard, otherwise known as scripting, where, say, a student was a fan of Thomas the Tank Engine and they watched this show quite a bit. Later on, at different points in their day, they might state sort of full sentences from those TV shows out of the blue. Sometimes children with autism will have a typical cadence or tone of their speech. So their speed might be slow than fast. Their tone of speech might be higher pitched or lower pitched. Often individuals who've been working with, in an early intervention program, working with women will often have a higher tone of speech, and that's likely just due to their surroundings. Pronoun reversal is common. Now, this happens with all children, but with individuals with autism it goes on a little longer. Poor comprehension of receptive language skills. Okay, so behavior functions as language in a number of ways. Let's look at these examples. So if a child stands by their TV and screams, and the parent approaches it and turns on the TV, the child quickly learns that screaming communicates that they want the TV on, and the parent learns that as well. So screaming becomes this functional communication. Child selects a PEC symbol of juice, an adult gets juice for the child. Again, this action of selecting the PEC symbol is a behavior that functions as language does, because it leads to getting what they wanted. Child in a teaching situation tantrums, and the teacher says, "Well, I guess you're not ready," and pauses teaching. That child has effectively communicated that with their tantrum that they don't want to do this right now. And it's quite effective. So I'm sure at this point I don't have to tell you the necessity of language as a core component in an intervention program for individuals with autism. It underlies most learning, and it effectively displaces problem behavior. Research on functional communication training has demonstrated this again and again. When we look back to early Lovaas style approaches to teaching language, we saw this very mass presentation of instructions at tabletop, which is still evidence-based, and many people are still doing it this way now. But language was taught in that sort of developmental hierarchy sequence, all through imitation. So kids would first imitate simple vowel sounds. Ah, you say to the child, say ah, child says ah. Then you move on to consonant sounds, blended consonant sounds, short words, complex words, etc. And the other core teaching component in this type of program was the labeling of objects. So show me car, show me duck. Okay, so language was sort of a combination of imitating sounds and words and then labeling objects. But this doesn't paint us the full picture of language and communication as it's needed. There's three major challenges to how discrete trial was traditionally done in teaching language. One is that generalizing language responses could be difficult because you're, in essence, teaching this skill at the tabletop in very tight stimulus control, and then you move to another environment and teach it again. Okay, it can be done, but it requires specific planning. Spontaneous use of language may not occur. There was no place where the children were expected to initiate language on their own outside of programs like PECS or incidental teaching. And language is very complex behavior. It's not as simple as imitation and receptive skills and then expressive skills. And that brings us to what we're going to talk about, which is Skinner's analysis of verbal behavior. Now, in 1957, Skinner wrote the book Verbal Behavior, but it probably wasn't until the 80s or later that the book began to be thoroughly analyzed. And it really wasn't until 2000s, early 2000s in parts of the US, up until mid-2000s, where we start really seeing the application of his work in the field of autism. So Skinner's account is a functional analysis of language. Language is functional, like we just said with those problem behaviors. And what Skinner did is he described a theory of language which in essence is no different than the way he described human behavior. We can observe it, measure it, and change it. It is functional. And he describes a number of verbal operands as the units of analysis in his ideas. I always like to throw some pictures up of some of the scholars in our field. Skinner defined language as behavior that is reinforced through the mediation of another person's behavior. Okay, so this is crucial because other behavior, nonverbal behavior, under Skinner's classification, is mediated by verbal behavior is mediated by another person and not directly reinforced by the environment like nonverbal behavior is. We'll get into this a little more. But at the bottom, here are some scholars in the field of verbal behavior. One of the primary scholars on our left is Dr. Jack Michael, who's a retired professor from Western Michigan University and a student of Skinner's. And I'm a huge fan of Dr. Jack Michael's, and if you ever have the opportunity to see him speak, it's well worth it. His student was Mark Sundberg, the author, Dr. Mark Sundberg, the author of Your Text, and he's also an excellent speaker, and his former business colleague, Dr. Jim Partington, again, sort of the two folks who really took verbal behavior to the masses in ABA. And then finally on the right is Dr. Vince Carbone, who's well known as well for his ability to help us look at language differently in terms of young learners with autism. Did I mention Hank Schlinger should probably also be in there? He's done a lot of work on verbal behavior, and at one point I believe he even counted all the number of times that Skinner said the word listener or something crazy in the book Verbal Behavior. Not sure if that's true, but it's an interesting rumor. But there's much less research on verbal behavior, and it's definitely an area that needs to be targeted. It is very much gaining in popularity and in research, as can be clearly seen by the discussions that all of you were having, and so many of you had either used VABLES or are currently using the ABLES and the VB map and whatnot, so that's pretty exciting. So what I'm going to do is take a break here, give you a break, and then I'll put the next section of the lecture in another component.